U.S. Attorney Alex Costa, he allegedly said that he did work for an intelligence agency. So could you resolve whether or not he did? And also, could you say why there was a minute missing from the jailhouse tape on the night of his death?
Yeah, sure. If I
Could I just interrupt for 1 second? Are you still talking about Jeffrey Epstein? This guy's been talked about for years. You're asking, we have Texas, we have this, we have all of the things. And are people still talking about this guy, this creep? That is unbelievable. Do you want to waste the time, and do you feel like answering?
I don't mind answering.
I mean, I can't believe you're asking a question on Epstein at a time like this where we're having some of the greatest success and also tragedy with what happened in Texas. It just seems like a desecration, but you go ahead.
That was a cabinet meeting yesterday that sent shock waves through the MAGA verse, in which President Donald Trump, after having promised for years to get to the bottom of the Epstein case, snapped at a New York Post reporter for daring to ask Attorney General Pam Bondi about where Epstein's alleged client lists went. People's interest in the Epstein story is really about control, or rather, who controls our elected leaders, notably the men and women in Congress. Our next guest, Congressman Tim Burchett of Tennessee, has been very open about how blackmailable his colleagues are. Listen.
It's how it works. You're visiting, you're out of the country or out of town, or you're in a motel or bar in D.C., and some whatever you're into, women or men or whatever, comes up and they're very attractive and they're laughing at your jokes and you're buying them a drink. Next thing you know, you're in the motel room with them naked, and next thing you know, you're about to make a key vote, and what happens? Some well-dressed person comes up and whispers in your ear, "Hey man, there's tapes out on you. Were you in a motel room on whatever with whoever?" And then you're like, "Uh-oh," and said, "You really ought not be voting for this thing."
Those who are upset with President Trump today are not necessarily upset with him per se. They believe that the Epstein case represents a classic tale of some foreign interest compromising our leaders through sexual and also likely financial blackmail, and getting those compromised leaders to support policies inimical to the U.S. national interest. Dr. Michael Scheuer, one of many former top CIA officials who has said as much in recent days. Here he is on our show, The Absolute Truth, saying this from earlier this week.
We are no more than the play toy of the Israelis. You want to know why that business about no list of people? It's because these Israelis and the CIA and MI6 were all involved in that adventure on Little St. James Island.
We're now joined by our friend, Congressman Tim Burchett. He's the Republican representative of Tennessee's 3rd District, my favorite district in Tennessee. He's one of the few elected leaders, I will also say, who is willing to speak openly about these issues, like blackmail. Congressman, it's good to see you. When we originally booked you on this interview, this is not what I had planned to talk about, but since you have talked about this topic in the past, I couldn't wait to hear what you make of the leaked DOJ memo that Bondi and the FBI have now confirmed its veracity, that was leaked to Axios, and President Trump's own statements regarding Epstein. Congressman?
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for having me on again, ma'am. And I'm in the 2nd District, actually. So,
sorry.
Yeah. You meant to say second, I know, because that is your favorite district.
It is. I actually grew up so close to there.
Yeah, that's. I know you did. I know thirds we butt up against each other, and possibly I got redistricted, so you could have been in both. Anyway, I was on the Benny show when I was talking about that, and oddly enough, I got a lot of grief from members and some in our leadership told me to quit talking about stuff like that. And then about a week later, a story broke, oddly enough, that there was a prostitution ring, oddly enough, run by somebody that was Chinese. and that it listed several groups of people that were in there. They said government officials, which alerted me to the thing, and powerful people, and I forget, there was like 3 categories, but that was pretty much it. And then oddly enough, about a week later, that story disappeared. And Benny, he's a buddy of mine on that, it runs the Benny show that you use that from. He had that article and he put it out and showed, we were just talking about that, and they never did release the black book, and that's always the way it goes. Somebody with enough money, enough power, enough influence goes in and changes it. And the Russians had a thing, and it had a name. It's called honeypots, and you can look it up. They use that, and that's what's been used. And now about Epstein thing, I think Pam Bondi got way out over her skis. She said, "I'm sitting here with a report on my desk," and then she released all this information. And the young and the bloggers and everybody they all came up to the White House, and they had those notebooks, and it turned out everything that was there was pretty much everything that everybody had anyway, and wasn't anything new. And I feel like at one time there was a list. And honestly, if Donald Trump was on that list, I think you would. Don't you think the Biden administration would have put that out? But I think there were powerful people on there. There's been rumors and innuendos. I think most of those are pretty true about who was on that. Some of the Hollywood elites and some other influential people in business, billionaire types that were on that list. And they, and I believe that list has been destroyed. I don't believe the Trump administration ever got the actual list that was there. I've talked to Bongino at length about this stuff earlier on. And so I get it, but that is Washington. And why do you think nobody trusts Washington? I mean, the Kennedy assassination, we had a hearing a couple of weeks or a month ago or so, and Chairwoman Luna chaired that. And, I asked a doctor who was in the room, in the emergency room where Kennedy's body was. He talked about an entry wound going one way and an exit wound going out, and an entry wound coming in the other way and going out. And he had a diagram up. That should have been a national news story, but they've waited so long and it's been so diluted that nobody, there was a conspiracy to kill John F. Kennedy, and there was possible government involvement, possible organized crime involvement, and others. And that proof has been brought out. Roger Stone wrote a book about it, but nobody's talking about it because enough time. And that's what this town does. They suppress information long enough, and the elites always get by with it until they meet their maker. And then, I think the Bible's pretty clear about what happens to people that abuse children. And am I disgusted? I am completely disgusted. But am I surprised? Go back and read some of my interviews before. I said, I don't think they're ever going to bring anybody in. I never thought they would, because we're in a fallen world, and Washington, D.C. is the tip of that spear, driving us straight to hell. And I'm not overreacting.
You're not. That's not hyperbole, Congressman.
Hyperbole.
Having spent so many years there.
I'm going to tell my press
I think sometimes people probably say we overstate it to sensationalize it for television. But I can tell you, when I moved in that city and I started covering Congress and politics, you could just feel it. Now, I am a Christian, so I'm more sensitive to that. But you can just feel it in that place. Look, you had said that. I think you even said that on this show, that you doubted anyone would be brought in, because we've talked about the blackmail issue many times, because I have often said that blackmail is the currency that DC runs on. That was very evident to me pretty early on in my career, and I went into it with totally naive, and it became clear.
Can I explain something? One other way they do it, and it's the most prevalent way, I think, is they employ a member of your family or your wife and your girlfriend, possibly. Mm-hmm. And, I think you're seeing that in some of these NGOs and other things. And that's why you're not seeing a big push to Congress to really defund things in USA, certain programs in there, because of those connections. And I've been told not to say those kind of things too. And I get it, but it's the truth. And
who tells you to say that, not to say that? Because when we're talking about the powers of control,
it's always somebody that's allegedly a friend of yours or close to you. It's the standard operating procedure. It's I remember one time somebody said something to me about something I was digging into, and it was in one of the tunnels, and they just happened to meet me there, walking, as my usual schedule, and said, "Hey, man, let me ask you something." And and they said, "Do you really want all this stuff out?" And and it was kind of and I was kind of, couldn't really decide if I was being measured or if I was being recorded or what. But I don't know. People call that paranoia until it comes out, months or years later, what really went down. So it's a crooked town. We got to get more involved. That's why when 12% of the population votes, that's what we get. Republicans were the worst at it. We elect a president and then we forget everything else. And we from school boards, city councils, mayors, state legislators, governors, and Congress. And we elected a president, we win. Well, go back and take a civics class, because it doesn't work that way. And when you've got dirtbags in office and you continue to reelect them, guess what? You got dirtbags, and they infect the rest of them.
That is so true and so well said. I think that's why people are so disappointed, though, is that they felt that they elected an administration who, I mean, by their own words, had promised, and like you said, perhaps Pam Bondi got out over her skis with this. In fact, your colleague, Representative James Comer, also had let us know not too long ago that the evidence probably had been destroyed already. He indicated that it was missing. One of our colleagues here at LindellTV asked Bondi about that on the North Lawn a matter of weeks ago, and she laughed it off. Let's take a listen to what she said about Representative Comer's statements.
No, the FBI, the FBI, they're reviewing, there are tens of thousands of videos of Epstein with children or child porn. And there are hundreds of victims. And no one victim will ever get released. It's just the volume, and that's what they're going through right now. The FBI is diligently going through that. I haven't seen that statement, but I'll call him later and find out.
She said she'd call him later and find out. She also said that she can't say whether or not Epstein was an intelligence asset, though there's been lots of, I would say, evidence that points in that direction. I think also the way they've messaged on this is not doing them any favors. They're making it sound as if it's definitive. He didn't conduct blackmail. And Pam Bondi has contradicted herself many times about these files. Her comments have not aged well. If they'd even just said, well, maybe the evidence had been destroyed, I think that's probably what has happened. I think there's probably some backups of it somewhere based on the fact that you had investigators in Florida also looking into Epstein. I think if you dug hard enough, you could probably find it. But they're not doing themselves any favors in creating or endearing themselves to the public trust by the way they're handling it, Congressman.
I couldn't agree with you more. I believe earlier on in the, Epstein was, I think, convicted at one time of something pretty minor, and that should have been that should have alerted the Florida authorities. So I don't know what went on down there. I don't know what's going on in Washington actually with it, because it's so convoluted, and the trail probably has gone pretty cold by now. I just wish everybody would have shut up. And anytime you see a delay in something, when they say, "Oh, we're going through it, we're sorting through it," that's a real sticking point with me. And these agencies, I think they need to be gutted top to bottom. But can you do that? And if you were to gut somebody like the CIA and just fire everybody, I mean, where would our intelligence in other countries be? And I think our enemies could abuse that. We didn't get here overnight. We're not going to clean it up overnight. Again, Trump's first administration, he fired the top level. Everybody thought that saved it. It's those second and third tier dirtbags that never seem to be gotten away. I'll give you an example. Committees have staff members, and some of the staffs, I mean, it could be over 40 staff members. And you wonder why no good legislation gets passed, or what happens is you bring a good bill like I did. The the bill defunding the Taliban. We found out through some sources they're getting close to $40 million. It took me over a week. The State Department said they have a document said close to $5 billion. We think it's flowed in there through some different sources. So it took me over a year, I mean, to get this thing through. And man, you know, it's like pulling teeth. Everybody wanted me to do a study or something. And so what happens? A lobbyist or some big shot's got some staffers here, and then they come to a congressman like myself who wants to pass something, who likes to see that article in the paper or on the local news, you know, Congressman such and such passes bill. Well, it keeps the same name, but then they just pass a study, you know, and that's the way they get you off their back. And then the bill goes away because another bright, shiny object will appear, or there'll be another wreck on the interstate, and it draws everybody's attention away. Oh, look at that over there. And then you're on to some other subject, and they know they can outlive you, and they've got the money. And the Chinese have done that very well with legislation, using lobbyists to do that, and maybe unbeknownst even to the lobbyists, because they're representing a business interest. And you know, and when you got a staff of maybe 50 people, how hard I always remember the liquor lobbyist, state of Tennessee, one time told me, he said, Burchett, I don't need a governor. I don't need the House and the Senate. I just need one chairman.
Yeah. It's not as expensive to buy people or buy your policy or your initiative as most Americans would imagine. I do want to ask you, because you talked about the lower level staff and cleaning it out, and it ties together with, they know they can wait you out, right? And that's what they're doing with Donald Trump right now. They're trying to run out the clock. I think if they take the House and Senate, we're going to see a much more aggressive push. But they're just trying to wait it out if you don't do enough. But here's my question too. How much, because Bongino and Cash had a tall order going in, right? Cash Patel. But I have a source. I talked to someone who lives in his building, and they tell me that Dan Bongino these days seems scared of his shadow. Do you think that Cash Patel and Dan Bongino are also being intimidated and perhaps approached in the way that you describe members of Congress are? They don't even have to have real blackmail on you anymore. You know, there's AI, there's all this other stuff.
Yeah. Oh, I know. I ran into Dan the other day right outside the Oval Office. I just met with the president. I was walking out. He was walking in. And no, I don't think so. I just think it's so big.
Okay.
And I think it's so overwhelming that there's so many other things that are possibly even bigger, if that's possible, than Epstein's situation.
Hard to imagine.
And it is hard to imagine, but when I'm sat here and told, you know, that I need to back, you know, $40 million to Taliban it doesn't even make national news. And I mean, that's a week. You know, I can't imagine what $40 million could do for Tennessee every week. The schools we could build, the people we could get into job training, trade schools, things like that. But, you know, we're 36 trillion in debt. Nobody cares about that. We're going off a cliff spiritually, morally, and financially. And we're going to lose everything if we're not careful.
We are. And that's my concern. I commend you on your Taliban legislation. Unfortunately, you're right. We celebrated it, and a lot of media clapped onto it. And it's because there is such a push to continue to, you know, conduct this, you know, funding of wars and military action. So before we go, I do have to ask you, I'm not going to take time to play the soundbite because everybody's seen it, but Trump said that he would send more weapons to Ukraine. It seemed like, you know, your former colleague, former Congressman John Ratcliffe, now CIA Director Ratcliffe, seemed very happy with that news. How do you feel about that? You sit on a relevant committee, sending more aid and weapons to Ukraine.
I don't want to send any more money overseas for that kind of thing. I've got an 18-year-old daughter. I just see us getting closer and closer to another war. And yeah, the war pimps are pushing it, and they control Congress. I mean, when a ranking member of Congress sits in a meeting and starts pointing out to people in the room where certain components of military apparatus are built in their districts and why you need to vote for it, not because we need it, is ridiculous. We're building aircraft carriers. We don't need them. It is advanced past that. A $3,000 drone could take out $500 billion worth of apparatus sitting on the deck of an aircraft carrier right now. We've got we got to plan ahead and not do what the war pimps at the Pentagon and Congress want to do. Makes people mad. They're looking at their stock portfolios, and that's wrong. It is completely wrong. And we got to change it. Americans got to get mad. This is why they got to get mad. They think they're going to get frustrated.
Well, at least people seem mad now. That's good. Maybe some good will come out of this, because people are upset, and rightly so, because you get to the point. This is why people are concerned their Congress is controlled, right? Because they keep spending like that overseas. They feel like, they vote this way that makes no sense for the people in their district. We're glad you focus on the people of Tennessee in the 2nd District. It's good to see you, Congressman Burchett. Thank you so much.
It's always a pleasure, ma'am. I appreciate kicking the hornet's nest with y'all.
Well, amidst all the controversy from yesterday's White House cabinet meeting and the anger over President Trump's dismissive comments about the Epstein case, many might have missed this bit of good news. The multi-year fight between Azerbaijan and Armenia might finally be coming to an end, as tomorrow the leaders of both countries are set to meet in Abu Dhabi to begin negotiating what many, including obviously Secretary of State Marco Rubio, hopes will be a peace treaty. But the costs of the conflict have already been too high, especially for our Christian brothers and sisters in Armenia. According to Armenia Weekly, quote, in Armenia and Artsakh, Christians' faith and cultural heritage have made them targets of aggression, particularly from Azerbaijan and Turkey. Artsakh, also known as Nagorno-Karabakh, has been home to Armenian Christians for centuries. However, this heritage has been systematically targeted, particularly by Azerbaijan. During the 2020 war, Azerbaijani forces shelled Armenian churches. Following Azerbaijan's blockade of the Lakan corridor in 2022 and 2023, over 120,000 Armenians were forced to flee, effectively ending the Christian presence in Artsakh. In other words, the Azerbaijanis have ethnically cleansed our Christian brothers and sisters in the disputed part of Armenia, and the United States, as well as our allies in Islamist Turkey and Israel, helped the Azerbaijanis, unfortunately, to do this. Of course, with all things beneath the ethnic cleansing and religious warfare, there are real geopolitical concerns afoot, which is why we turn to our friend, the preeminent geopolitical analyst and author most recently of The Noble State Governance Options in an Ignoble Era. Mr. Gregory Copley joins us now. Greg, it's good to see you. I think this is a bit of a bright spot. Some people will say, well, we don't want to be involved anywhere. But what's also interesting about this, Greg, I was talking to Michael Scheuer the other day about this. And I said, well, if we're going to give Israel what it wants on the conflict in Iran, can we not ask them to help us out in Armenia, considering they are, supplying weapons, selling weapons to the Azerbaijanis to, for this ethnic cleansing. And then lo and behold, it gets mentioned. And I had no idea it might be on the docket. I know Rubio met with Netanyahu himself. So is this a product of perhaps we are trying to get a little bit something out of this for the Armenian Christian population, which is one of the oldest, if it's the oldest in the world?
Well, the good news, of course, is that they're meeting to work on a peace treaty or resolve a peace treaty tomorrow in Abu Dhabi. And that's really good news. But we have seen that this conflict has been underway, well, since the breakup of the Soviet Union. And it wasn't the fault of the Azerbaijanis. The Azerbaijan is a very multi-ethnic, multi-confessional country, which has a large Christian population, a large Jewish population as well, which is partly why Israel is involved there. And yes, Turkey was supporting Azerbaijan, but it's Azerbaijan which was resisting the illegal takeover of huge amounts, about up over a quarter of Azerbaijani territory was taken over in 1990-91 after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Armenians pushed forward and then had the Russians basically put a Russian army in Armenia to bolster those claims to Azerbaijani territory. Now, Nagorno-Karabakh and the Lachen corridor were absolutely secure and were promised a continuation by the Azerbaijani government of Ilham Aliyev. And basically, the Armenians kept insisting that this was Armenian territory. And under international law and history, this was always part of Azerbaijan. Now, Azerbaijan said you can keep this as a Christian or Armenian-speaking enclave. That's not a problem, but this is Azerbaijani territory. And Armenia kept ignoring this, and very foolishly, because the Armenian government is enormously corrupt, although the new Prime Minister, Pashinyan, is trying to clean it up. But basically, the Armenians kept shelling across from occupied parts of Azerbaijan into the Azerbaijani territory proper, killing a lot of Azerbaijanis. And they failed to note that Azerbaijan was getting richer and richer and richer because of its oil and gas revenues. And Azerbaijan basically held the line and lashed back. And it got to the point where Armenia was literally ready to be overrun and crushed by Azerbaijan, which held back on this. But what was going on for until the last couple of years was that the United States government was basically holding back Azerbaijan, which is the key to the control of Central Asia and the Caspian Sea and the like, and was supporting Armenia in the OECD talks. So essentially, we're now seeing that by dint of the fact that Azerbaijan finally took control of Nagorno-Karabakh, basically, and control of the Lachin corridor, and the Russians eventually were taken by surprise, pulled back from that, and basically offered to guarantee and broker a ceasefire. Armenia broke that ceasefire on a number of occasions, but it was moving towards the inevitable, where they had to find a peace treaty. And now, of course, the Armenian constitution was written after the collapse of the Soviet Union, saying that all of this land was Armenian, which was not historically the case. So essentially, the peace treaty is going to discuss whether Armenia rewrites its constitution, which will not claim Azerbaijani territory. They will resume their historical trade across the area, including trade down to the exclave of Nakhchivan, which was a part of Azerbaijan cut off by Armenia. So all of this is set to resolve, and this could greatly enhance the ability of the outside world to connect with Central Asia through Azerbaijan, through Armenia, into Central Asia, the Caspian, and so on. Very important strategically for the US. And finally, because of the Trump administration, the US is not backing this old OECD line, which was not allowing a peace deal to be done. That's now possible. And yes, the Trump administration can take some credit for that.
So let's talk about the further political implications of this. If say a peace deal could hold in that area, this is essentially, you could say, as you alluded to, because of Russia's involvement and support of Armenia, it has become somewhat of a proxy fight in a way, right, between the U.S., Israel, Turkish alliance and the Russia, China, Iran alliance. It's another part of those, outlying conflicts. And not only is Azerbaijan allowing its territory to be used by Israel to launch attacks on Iran, but relations between Baku and Moscow are really bad. Okay, this one outlet puts it has gone in the toilet, which could have major implications for the destabilization campaign against Tehran and the entire Eurasian, as they note, landmass, as the country is one of the most important transport and logistics hubs in the region. As you just pointed out, how it would open it up to the rest of the world. So how likely is it that a peace deal is achieved and holds? And then how does it affect these other ongoing conflicts, Iran and Israel, and Ukraine and Russia?
Well, you have to bear in mind that Iran has been the great sponsor of Armenia, more than Russia. I mean, far more important than Russia, because Iran has been providing Armenia with its oil and gas. So that's been very critical. So you've got all of these sort of mixed messages. And now Prime Minister Pashinyan in Armenia has definitely taken, if you like, the issue to heart, wants a resolution, because it's the only way Armenia can now prosper. And there can be a massive exchange in that whole region once Azerbaijan and Armenia do achieve a peaceful relationship, and I think it can hold. The Russians have basically told the Armenians to stop, relying on Russia to support them when they would attack Azerbaijan. And the wars, by the way, which resulted in Armenia's defeat, were because the Armenians started killing Azerbaijanis across the de facto border from the Armenian occupied areas of Azerbaijan into Azerbaijan proper. So basically, the Armenians have been brought to their senses. This caused the collapse of the Armenian government. Pashinyan's there. He just met with President Erdogan in Turkey, who's basically also said, okay, enough's enough, let's get this under control. The Azerbaijanis clearly want better access to the outside world, and they want that overland corridor across Armenian territory into the exclave of Nakhchivan, and that has a border with Turkey. But as we gradually see this opening up, and as we see the changes occurring in Iran, and I believe there will be a change of government in Iran imminently, possibly a military figure taking control, then you start to see this massive new economic zone opening up, not just including Armenia, Azerbaijan, Iran, but also going well into the 5 Central Asian stands. And then you have a major economic boom, and you have the US involved in Central Asia, separating Russia on the one hand and the People's Republic of China on the other, although those two are no longer friends anyway.
Yeah, true. Look, if Trump can achieve this peace deal, it's another notch, right? Another point in his possible, his desire for a Nobel Peace Prize, and we all want peace. So we'll be watching this. I don't, it doesn't get a lot of attention, so I'm glad that you could join us to talk about it, because it is an issue that we have focused on here on The Absolute Truth, over the years. So we will be watching it closely. It just piqued my interest that Rubio had brought that up in the cabinet meeting. I literally just been talking about it on Monday. So we'll see how these talks in Abu Dhabi proceed, and then we'll have you back to discuss it, Greg.
Wonderful, wonderful. Looking forward.
A massive lawsuit filed by a group of doctors is underway now, targeting the current Health and Human Services Secretary, Mr. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Now, according to biotech analyst Karen Kingston, quote, an unnamed plaintiff, unnamed Dr. Jane Doe, claims that Kennedy's CDC directive regarding providing informed consent on COVID-19 vaccines for pregnant women creates barriers to access to the vaccine and has left Jane and her husband overwhelmed with stress and uncertainty. Even though she is a doctor and her doctors advised her to get another dose later in pregnancy to better protect herself and her baby from contracting this deadly disease. It's just like we always knew, honestly, these doctors don't care about our safety. They care about control. Your right to choose whether or not to be vaccinated, choose whether or not to vaccinate your kids. That's the threat to their precious worldview and their bottom line. Everything's about control. That could be the theme of the show today. After all, there are already reports indicating that there has been such a rise in vaccine hesitancy amongst Americans that pediatricians' offices are massively scaling back purchases of vaccines from pharmaceutical companies. And that's likely the real cause of this lawsuit against RFK. Now, we reported about this earlier this week. Our friends at the Brownstone Institute got an exclusive report on how back in April, Big Pharma executives met and outlined a game plan for undermining RFK's leadership at HHS. Why? Well, it's obvious, right? Because he threatened to sow doubt about the need for vaccines, a huge moneymaker, which would massively dent Big Pharma's bottom line, which clearly thrives on the demand for vaccines and other treatments that Kennedy is rightly calling into question. Joining us now is Karen Kingston. She's a noted biotech analyst and the author of the always excellent Kingston Report on Substack. Karen, it's good to see you. We knew this kind of lawfare would be waged, so that's absolutely no surprise. The claims of stress and lack of sleep kind of crack me up a little bit, and you can't put your name on it. You're Dr. Jane Doe. How effective could this campaign be? Because I do imagine that pharma is worried, because I can tell you anecdotally when I'm talking to moms in the area now, everybody knows my vaccine story with my kids. I chose not to vaccinate. I've been very open about why. I've shared that story on Dr. Drew and all over the place. But I am hearing more mothers open up to me and say, I'm not getting the childhood vaccines anymore now. I don't feel comfortable based on what we know. So obviously pharma is worried and they're going on the warpath, yes?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, there was a survey done in January of Americans, and one out of 5 parents, 17%, were denying all childhood vaccines. They were saying we're not on the vaccine schedule at all. But as I read through this lawsuit, the medical complex, they created a hornet's nest for themselves, right? Because what are they doing? They're suing the Secretary of Health and Human Services. And they're also claiming that all of the vaccines are under emergency use authorization. Therefore, none of the doctors can be sued or have any charges brought against them if anyone was harmed by the COVID vaccines. But now they're suing the boss, where the buck stops under emergency use authorization in the PrEP Act, the Secretary of Health and Human Services. So if this lawsuit goes through, they're going to that gun is going to turn around and be pointed straight at them. And I think as I've read through the lawsuit, it's obvious to me that they are upset now that parents of children and pregnant women they're not just questioning the quote unquote safety of the COVID-19 vaccines. They're saying, hey, when you vaccinated my child and he ended up going into a seizure after getting the COVID shot, or he got blood clots, was that because of the shot? That's why they're freaking out. And now they're suing RFK Jr. saying, you don't have the right to rewrite the rules of the emergency use authorization immunity that we have. So you better put those shots back on the schedule. Now, here's the kicker. For children under the age of 12, the product was never approved. The COVID shots were never approved. So now the American Academy of Pediatrics is saying that HH Secretary Kennedy is wrong. And the American Academy of Pediatrics, your child's pediatrician, is saying that your unvaccinated child is a threat to national security. Therefore, they must be injected. They're violating the laws, they're violating the Code of Federal Regulations, and they're creating a hornet's nest for themselves. So I hope this does go through.
So, okay. Let's talk about that EUA and the fact that it was this has never been approved for children. Right.
It's never been approved for children under the age of 12.
Okay. It's still operating under the emergency use authorization. How long can it, we're now going on several years, Karen. At some point, it's that old thing, the S or get off the pot, right? Just how long can it operate? And then I have a story to share, but I want to hear what you say about this emergency use authorization.
So under the law, under the Code of Federal Regulations, the guidance, which is what Pfizer's contract is aligned to, at the 2017 guidance that was written, is that an emergency use authorization for a product such as a vaccine can only really be in place for 6 months. And if it's going to be in place for longer than 6 months, they must conduct, and they can start conducting the clinical trials ahead of time to get FDA approval. So Pfizer did get FDA approval in 2021. Peter Marks ordered it, right? Remember in August of 2021, the very morning that he ordered it, Marion Gruber and Dr. Malarkey resigned. They were the head of the vaccine division at the FDA because they knew it was an unlawful approval, right? And so they got the approval, and then Pfizer put up their Comirnaty website and started promoting it. I heard ads in my local grocery stores promoting it, promoting the Comirnaty shot. And then they realized that they broke their immunity under emergency authorization. And somehow or another, they wrote a new Code of Federal Regulations. And now they're claiming that the FDA approved product is designated as emergency use authorized. But for the product for the children under the age of 12, it was never FDA approved. And because it was never FDA approved under emergency use authorization, an EUA product, every American has the right to accept or refuse, deny the product with informed consent. So it never had any business being on the CDC schedule for children under the age of 12. They're just breaking the laws and making them up as they go along. And what they're saying is, well, because of Chevron deference, which was overruled last summer in the Loper Bright case, that they can, the federal agencies, HHS, CDC, FDA, can make up the laws as they go along. Now, again, that was overruled last year, and actually several different lawsuits that were brought to the Supreme Court. So it's a hornet's nest. What, at the end of the day, I mean, if the doctors, if the American Academy of Pediatrics can sue RFK Jr. to say, we want you to put the shots back on the CDC schedule, then MAHA moms and attorneys can sue RFK Jr. for not following procedure, for neglecting the evidence that these shots have caused an overwhelming level of disease, disabilities, and death in adults and children and pregnant women, and have the shots pulled off the market for a Class 1 recall for the FDA-approved products, and also to revoke the emergency use authorization because it's out. They've exhausted the timeline, right? And Becerra signed a. Yeah, they're only supposed to be for 3 months at a time. 3 months a time for emergency for the threat to national security declaration to be made. Every 3 months it has to be renewed. Becerra made up his own new law when he was in there under Biden, and he extended it for an additional 5 years until 2029.
If MAHA moms did do that, I will tell you, Karen, it would push the Kennedy HHS to do something about that EUA, because based on conversations I've had, I can tell you where some key officials are at right now. They understand that if they pull the EUA for the childhood, for children, that the shots would be pulled off the market essentially for children, right? And they don't want to do that yet based on the blowback they would get from the corporate media, and because immunocompromised or sick children won't be able to get the vaccine. Now, I know that's hard to believe with the people who were supposed to be put there, but that, I think, based on several conversations I had, that's where their thinking is. So they're nowhere near pulling that EUA right now, and for children. And they believe that, there are key officials in there who still believe that sick children should get it, despite all the detrimental effects we just have talked about for years. So if MAHA moms did that, the lawfare like the big pharma, maybe that counter pressure would push them in the right direction. I'm just saying that that's where
I am furious. I am furious that these are still on the market for children, right? And I looked at the data for the children. Go back to the phase 3 clinical trials. In the trials for babies, 6 months old to less than 2 years old, there was a subset of 344 babies. Only 3 of the babies made it to their dose 3 follow-up visit. We don't know what happened to 341 babies, and the reasons for withdrawal included death. We don't know what happened to those children. They changed the primary endpoints because the children were becoming sick and hospitalized and dying. So some children who got robust immune response ended up being hospitalized, going into seizures, having neurological disorders, or dying, but they had a robust immune response. I'm just with the children.
The EUA should be pulled. And sometimes it's about who yells the loudest. And right now, the feeling from the bureaucracy and even the administration is still big pharma, and it's still, this lawfare that, the corporate media that's yelling the loudest. So that's all I'm saying. Karen Kingston, thank you for being one of those voices who's not afraid to speak up. I hope your, information makes it to them. I know it does some. So here's to hoping they pull that EUA. Thank you, Karen Kingston.
Thanks, Emerald. But it's nonsense. You can't sue anyone under the PrEP Act. They're suing the Secretary of Health and Human Services right now. Lawyer up, woman. Just lawyer up.
There you go. From the mouth of Ms. Kingston. Thank you so much. Good to see you. The Comey Brennan investigation leaked to Fox Digital yesterday. Stinks to high heaven. Let's call it what it is. It looks like a distraction that was planted by the intelligence community to get people to stop talking about the Epstein scandal. Look at the timing. Look at the outlet. Totally unserious. But if you're actually keeping score, this is where we currently sit. People arrested for Russiagate, 0. People arrested for the COVID pandemic, like Dr. Fauci, 0. People arrested for the Butler assassination, of which the 1-year anniversary is this Sunday. We'll have a special on that with Vanessa Broussard, 0. A Mar-a-Lago raid, 0 people. The 2020 election coup thus far, 0 people arrested. So it really doesn't matter until you arrest someone. I feel like this is Groundhog Day 2018 when they were saying, indictments are coming, indictments are coming, indictments are coming. Does not matter until their arrest. Fortunately, the Marxist communists in the Biden regime understood that very well. By this point in the Biden presidency, they had already arrested hundreds of Trump supporters on trumped-up charges. It didn't matter if there was evidence, because there wasn't. And if there is not accountability for that, if there is not accountability for Russiagate, they will do it again. One need only to look to the continued political persecution of Brazil's Jair Bolsonaro, the former president of Brazil, often compared to our own populist president, Donald Trump. Prosecutors accuse Bolsonaro of plotting to overturn the 2022 election results to stay in power. He faces charges of rebellion and attempting a coup. Bolsonaro could face up to, according to the outlets in Brazil, 40 years in prison if he's convicted on all the counts against him. They tried the same thing with Donald Trump. And though they failed, just as they did with impeachment hoaxes, they will try again. In fact, well-placed sources tell me that swampy big DC law firms are currently preparing indictments and cases against the Trump administration officials should a Democrat take over, and their buddies in the DOJ and FBI will help them out. This effort includes charges of treason against President Donald Trump. It appears Trump sees the parallels between he and Jair Bolsonaro. Trump posted this to Truth Social in the last couple of days regarding the trial related to Bolsonaro, saying, quote, Brazil is doing a terrible thing on their treatment of former President Jair Bolsonaro. He said, I've watched as the world, as they have done nothing but come after him day after day, night after night, month after month, year after year. He's not guilty of anything except having fought for his people. There's nothing more or less than an attack on a political opponent, something I know much about, says Trump. It happened to me, times 10. I'll add it will happen again. And now our country is the hottest in the world. The great people of Brazil will not stand for what they are doing to their former president. And in fact, thousands of Brazilians did take to the streets of Sao Paulo in a recent show of support for the former president amidst his trial. And joining us now for more on this is journalist Paulo Figueiredo. He is the host of the Paulo Figueiredo Show. It's good to see you, Paulo. It's been some time since we spoke, yet not much has changed in Brazil in regards to the persecution of Jair Bolsonaro. Tell us about this trial and how it's been going.
Thanks for having me, Emerald. If anything changed, it got worse. President Bolsonaro is probably less than 2 months away of being in prison for the rest of his life. The max sentence time could be up to 40 years, as you said. And it's not like Brazil has parallels with the United States, pretty much a copy and paste. United States had Donald Trump rising to power in 2016. It was the big moment of the national populist movement in the United States. The same thing happened in Brazil 2 years later in 2018. In 2020, Trump lost the election in the United States. Let's say it was at least a disputed result. Several claims of fraud, widespread fraud. In Brazil had the same issue in 2022. United States had January 6 riots right after the election. Brazil had January 8th riots right after the year of the election. People being framed, several, several claims, fundamental claims of agent provocateurs and people being framed, infiltrated people from the deep state in both riots, and over 1,000 people sent to prison in insane charges for over 10 years. So it's very, very similar. Donald Trump was indicted for a bunch of phony things, trumped up charges like insurrection being one of them. Jair Bolsonaro being framed as well, being charged for crazy things like not falsifying a COVID vaccine card and including almost identical insurrection charge. And that's what is most likely going to send him to prison very soon, unless the Trump administration takes a more aggressive stance on Brazil.
Okay, so let me just clarify this. What you're saying is they've tried the same political charges for, say, insurrection, sedition, et cetera, or, very similar charges against Jair Bolsonaro. What will actually send him to prison is falsifying a
No,
vaccine passport.
that was one of the charges, but what is actually going to send him to prison is the insurrection charge, attempting the abolition of the democratic state in the country.
So let me ask you, Paulo, because you just said it's inevitable unless the Trump administration takes a stronger posture on what's going on in Brazil. What does that look like? What could the Trump administration do to help Jair Bolsonaro?
Well, they have been working internally, and Secretary Rubio talked about it a little over a month and a half ago, about sanctioning Moraes under the Global Magnitsky Act. So the United States has a powerful tool on its arsenal, which is financial sanctions, financial OFAC sanctions. Pretty much under the Global Magnitsky Act, any person who violates globally human rights are subject to OFAC sanctions. So you're included on the SDN list, the Special Designated Nationals list, and that stops you from doing business with any United States person or any U.S. institution. So that includes bank accounts globally being frozen, because all the banks in the world do business with through the United States through the SWIFT system, but also has other consequences. You can have a Facebook account. Technically, you can even order lunch at McDonald's because it's a US-based company. So it's the most powerful financial sanction that the United States has. And Moraes has violated all the human rights and is clearly subject to the Global Magnitsky Act, but it's a decision of the President of the United States. You had letters from members of Congress and from several people urging the President to act. And most recently, yesterday and on Monday, he has been posting about the Bolsonaro situation, but we haven't seen yet actual sanctions against Moraes, which would be the only option for the Brazilian opposition to have some leverage about this guy who is the de facto dictator of Brazil. He persecuted all the political opposition, not only Bolsonaro, including journalists. Myself, I'm included. I'm also indicted on the same case as Bolsonaro, also facing same charges. The only reason I'm not in prison yet is because I'm here in the United States. But Bolsonaro's running mate, several generals, people in Bolsonaro's party, members of Congress. Bolsonaro's son, the most voted congressman in the history of Brazil, is now in the United States under exile as well. So it's there's Brazilian institutions doesn't have a way to react anymore. So that's why there's a lot of people have been asking for the United States to step in, not only because of that, but because a lot of this was created, a lot of this mess was created by the Biden administration. The Biden administration directly interfered in the Brazilian election in 2022 to guarantee Moraes was not challenged and to make sure the socialist Lula da Silva got back to power. And also, USAID sent an enormous amount of money to Brazil to guarantee all the disinformation programs, which were just a code word for censorship, that guaranteed that Moraes was not going to be challenged. So the United States is co-responsible for the situation in Brazil. At least the Biden administration.
I'm glad you mentioned how the USAID money flowed into that and put Brazil in the situation that it's in, because I think we've kind of quickly moved over off that news cycle right here in the United States, but that's still central to all of the shenanigans that's been going on across the globe. Well, not just across the globe, but within our own domestic borders as well. Paulo, so let me leave you with this final question. Say the U.S. does do sanctions on Moraes, which, we've talked about who he is on this show multiple times, that Supreme Court judge in Brazil. Would it directly benefit you as well as an indicted, quote unquote, how they put it here in the United States, co-conspirator of Bolsonaro? Could the Trump administration help you out, Paulo?
Well, I'm fairly safe here in the United States. I've been here for 11
Good.
years. There's no way the United States would extradite me. But yeah, sure, it would benefit mostly everyone. Brazil right now has in Congress a bill that's called the amnesty bill. So it's pretty much a blank pardon, congressional pardon for everyone that was involved in political charges since 2019. That's when all this started by Moraes. And that would also rehabilitate President Bolsonaro, who's now leading all the polls to 2026. The election is in 2026. The problem is that the speaker of, although there are more than enough votes in Congress, they need 257. They have over 320 votes in favor of the amnesty. The speaker of the House needs to put the bill on the floor. And in order to, and he started to do that, but the minute that he did that, he got threatened by Moraes. His father house was raided by the federal police of Brazil, and then he
Right.
withdrew the bill. And right now, what the sanctions do is that they create leverage for the opposition in Brazil to pass this bill, giving amnesty. So the sanctions are pretty much a jumpstart for the Brazilian institutions to react and solve the problem in the country.
You know, we're living in like parallel universes, Brazil and the United States. Paulo, thank you so much for giving us this update, and we will keep our eye on it. This is very important to our own